Good morning, class. Today is the first day of week number 8. It's May 4th. Back in the days, we were saying that the quarantine was going to be over in April 1st, but it has already been over a month already. And I really miss you guys. The Most of the topics that we are covering now, it's not even geometry, it's really dealing with Algebra 2 stuff, but hopefully we get to see each other again towards the last 2 weeks of the marking period. I hope that whatever that we are learning in this class, it will help you with the Algebra 2 when you guys take it next year. Okay, we are going to talk about frequency and period that deals with phase shift along with it as well. Now, this is the last topic for trigonometric graphing that deals with sine and cosine. So next week, what we're going to do is we're actually going to dive into the tangent graphs. That's the only graph that we haven't talked about yet. And then once the time permits, then we're going to be able to do the other 3 trigonometric function graph, which are called cosecant, secant, and cotangent. So you'll be able to graph not just sine and cosine, but tangent and these inverse trig functions, which we would like to call them as well. So there's a total of 6 total trig graphs that you have to know. But they all follow the same type of format, which is amplitude, frequency, phase shift, and vertical shift, or we like to call it A, B, theta, let's say, and then this is value C in the equation. So no matter what trig functions you're going to get, it will always follow the format of A, if I'm using sine, B times x minus theta plus C. We have went over every single component so far. Today what we're going to do is we're going to dive into involving the B value along with the phase shift. Very, very, very basic ones we're going to start it off. So let's take a look at some of the example that looks like this. Okay, so in here I'm giving you a very simple one that says sine of 2x minus pi. Now notice how the b value is always outside the parentheses, and I really need you to pay attention to that because there's a difference between this and this. If I ever give you this, the phase shift is not pi to the right because it has to be factored out, so you want to make it like this, and that will be your phase shift. Well, how did I get pi over 2? Well, because if you take out the 2 from here and here, it should be like from here and here, if you take out the 2, that means that I got to divide this by 2 and I got to divide this by 2, which makes it x minus pi over 2. That value, the 2 in the front, will make the frequency value, and that will change your new period. But your phase shift will always has to be independent in one parentheses like this, outside from the b value. So let's fill out the chart here. Your amplitude is going to be 1 for today, no matter what. Your vertical shift, you're not going to have anything. Your frequency is whatever this number says, so it's 2. Your period is 2 pi divided by 2, which is pi. You should already know that. And each increment I'm going to make it is pi over 4. Pretty self-standard explanatory stuff. These 3 kind of go hand in hand together. Now the phase shift here is going to be pi to the right. That's what we're going to be using. Last week we said that the number 5 we're just going to simply say none, and then that's going to be over. But this week we're all going to be dealing with phase shifts along with the new period. Okay, so what we're going to do here is now we're going to establish our frame, right? I hope you guys did this in the quiz. I asked you always to establish your framework. Your vertical shift is at 0, so it's at 0. Amplitude is 1, so you go up 1, and then you go down 1. So those would be your up and downs. And now the sine always starts with the middle, and then goes to max, and then middle for regular positive sine of x. So that is going to be my pattern going up and down per each increment of pi over 4. So I'm going to make each of these increments to be pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4. If I want to complete it, just 5 pi over 4, that's also okay. This is negative pi over 4, negative 2 pi over 4, negative 3 pi over 4, negative 4 pi over 4, and so on. And now, since I've established the increment, I know the amplitude and know the framework. Vertical shift, there's none. Phase shift, I know it's to the pi to the right. So before we actually do this part, when we have a phase shift, we need to take care, I'm going to call this step number 1.5, we need to take care of the phase shift. Okay, because the phase shift is actually where we're going to kind of start. If it was a regular sine, sure, we start right here. We start right down in the center. But that's not what's happening because that center point has moved all the way to the right to the 4 pi over 4, and that's what's happening. So, I don't know if this is the better color to use. Okay, so probably going to use green here. Okay, so this point that was supposed to be at 0, 0, now moved to 4 pi over 4. Which means then if I go to the right, I go next step on the list, which is max. So I go maximum. And then this wave will go on and on and on this way. But that means I got to go in the opposite direction. That's what we're going to do, right? So sine starts here. That's your starting point. Then you go to min, mid, max, mid, and then this continues to go on and on and on. And this will be your wave. Now you will notice that, hey, wait a minute, it didn't really change that much because this, even if I started here, it wouldn't make any that difference. Well, that's particularly because we're actually moving in the increment of pi, moving pi to the right. So if we actually move it pi to the right, the actual period is pi, right? So imagine this wave, this one full wave, just moving this wave to the right. Oh, I can't really relate. Yeah, so I take this wave and I move it to the right. And it matches exactly as it is. So there's actually no point in actually doing a phase shift because your phase shift matches the period, which is pi. So therefore, there is really not much change in the graph. But let's take a look at the second example. Now notice how I'm giving you 1 over 2 for your frequency value, and pi over 4 to the left for your phase shift value. So if your frequency is 1/2, your new period is 2 pi divided by 1/2, which is 4 pi. Okay, so that means it's a very, very long, elongated graph. But I am telling you that I'm moving phase shift to the left by pi over 4. That's very, very incrementally small compared to everything. So then it's going to make it a little bit more challenging for us to do. But let's fill all of this up. So each increment would be 4 pi divided by 4, which makes it pi. The amplitude is going to be 1. Phase shift is going to be pi over 4 to the left. Okay, so everything is established here. Now I'm going to make sure that my framework is fine. So I'm going to start at 0. That's my max. And that's my min, which is my positive one, and that's my negative one. Now each of my increment has to be pi, so I'm gonna go ahead and do exactly that. So I'm gonna make sure this right here is pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, and then 4 pi. And this would be 5 pi. In that direction, I'm gonna make this negative pi, negative 2 pi, negative 3 pi, negative 4 pi, and so on. You get the idea. Alright, so once all of that is established, now what I want to do is I want to start from where my phase shift was. Because once I establish my framework, that's always my number 1 step. My number 2 now for when we're done doing with the phase shift, start at the phase shift. That's what we want to do. Now pi over 4 to the left is tricky because if this is pi over 2, negative pi over 2, then half of that would be negative pi over 4. So that is exactly where we're actually going to start, and we're starting, this is your starting value right here. Now this is where it gets tricky. Negative cosine means I start at min, then I go to mid, then I go to max. So I'm going to start right here at minimum. Okay? Okay, so now what do we do? Now what happens after that is that every increment is pi. So it's going to be hard to do so, but that means that I need to move everything by 2 increments. So like this, what I mean by 2 increments is this, right? Imagine I move 2 increments of this thing from here. Do you see how it reaches exactly halfway between pi over 2 and pi? That value right there turns out to be 3 pi over 4. Because that's halfway between pi over 2 and pi. Now, why am I telling you this? Is because from here, which we start at negative pi over 4, to 3 pi over 4, the distance between these two is pi. And that's the one increment that we have been talking about right here. So my next point on the list will happen right here. So that's my min, that's my mid. Where do you think it's going to happen next? Well, I'm going to move 2 increments to the left, to the right again, right? So I take this. I really cannot move this part only. Okay, so let's say I move this part right here. If I move it 2 units to the right, 2 increments to the right, then I end up right here. And the pattern continues. I'm going to move it to the maximum over there. And lo and behold, this value right here, this one right here is, what is it, 3 pi over 2. Halfway between 2 pi and 3 pi over 2 will be 7 pi over 4. And between 3 pi over 4 and 7 pi over 4, that's another pi. And this will go on and on and on. So I'm gonna just skip the value right here, then skip the value right here, and then skip the value here. You can kind of tell the pattern is like you go 1.5 units increments away. So like that's half, 1, half, that's 2, half, 1, half, that's 2. That's what I mean by 2 increments. So when you keep on doing this, the wave, if I connect the dots right here, it will look like this. Okay, now wait a minute. On the y-intercept, it wasn't at middle, it wasn't at minimum, or it wasn't at maximum. Is that okay? Yes, absolutely. Because why? Because the phase shift was pi over 4 to the left. This is why it gets really tricky, and that's why it's very important for you to be able to identify what these units and what these increments and what these phase shift is going to be, because one small mistake and I won't be able to read your graph. Look at all of this stuff right here. It's tricky. That's why I'm saving phase shift to the last. For today, you're going to be getting something that's a lot easier to do than this. However, if I give you something like that, you should be able to understand how to do these questions and make sure you period each increment, all of these checks out, and move the phase shift according to whatever it's telling you, and move by each increment onto the X scale. Okay, that is the main objective for today. Obviously, for the other half, you can just copy and paste it, this part to here, and you'll get the idea. Okay, so you're gonna get 2 questions for homework today. That's going to be it. Tomorrow and on later down this week, we'll be incorporating everything all together. I'm gonna give you a quiz on Friday. Thank you and have a good day.